Welcome to the module on inclusive science communication and public engagement. My name is Philipp Schrögel, and I'm happy to talk with you a little bit um, about, the whole issue. It's about science communication, and science communication has diversified a lot over the last years, and there are a lot of things going on: science festivals, public talks. There are even participatory forms of actually doing science that go beyond science communication, citizen science aspects, or open science itself that's enabling the public to take part in scientific processes, read articles, contribute to scientific projects and citizen science approaches, or including public opinion on and generating science and technology, for example, in the responsible research and innovation concept. So a lot of opening, a lot of communicating about science, about the results, about the things that are going on. But there's one question that's not addressed that often. So who are actually the publics that are engaged, that are engaging in these various forms of science communication? That's what we are going to focus on here in this module. Is the public really the overall public? And by posing this question, you might have guessed already, or you already know that this is obviously not the case, or maybe not so obviously. So that's the reason why we did this module. So who are population groups that are reached, and much more important, who are the people that are not reached by science communication, that are left out, that are marginalized, that they are maybe discriminated against in these various aspects of science communication? This is what we're going to talk about in this module, compiling various perspectives and different voices on the issue. Starting here, we're building on the experiences we had in the research project Science for All that I did in my former position at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, together with Wissenschaft and Dialog, where we explored the issue. We looked at which population groups are not reached, and in the second part, developed pilot projects with 3 exemplary groups in a participatory approach and see what can be done better. So this graphic you've seen on my right and the whole time is one of the central results of our research projects. During the research project, we developed a typology of exclusion factors. I'm going to talk about that more in detail a little later. And to communicate our results to science communication practitioners, we decided to develop a graphic that is communicating these things and invites to explore the various more complex social science issues and also reflect on the science communication practices. We're going through this graphic step by step, so you probably cannot read everything here in the video. It's also linked below, but we're going to address some of the issues. The overall question, who does science communication not reach? Well, that's the leading question for our project. And before we go into detail, there's one important way of thinking about the issue, and it has a lot to do about the concept of openness, the concept of freedom from open science, free knowledge, and then also open communication. If open science or open science communication is understood in terms of a negative concept of freedom, so meaning freedom is freedom from external restrictions, the absence of, for example, technical barriers, then this is achieved when you just have a public talk and say, well, everybody can come, or in open science, when you publish data and say, okay, it's open data now and everybody can access that. Well, this is a prerequisite for being open and being accessible, but it doesn't ensure that the communication is actually accessed and that it's actually really accessible for the whole population. There might be a lot of, individual barriers that implicitly or explicitly exclude various people. And in order to think the other way around, it's better to have a positive concept of freedom, the freedom to do something. So what does it actually take that it is actually used, that communication is actually reaching the audiences, engaging with audiences? And about these various barriers that might prevent free access and that might make science communication exclusive. They can be a lot of things, lack of familiarity in dealing with science, the habitual exclusion through formulations, wordings, behavior, or implicit hierarchies. So there are a lot of things going on, and this is what we're going to try to tackle here, and which is also hopefully this lesson and also the graphic is contributing to. When we're talking about excluded population groups, the first decision we made in the project is that it's really difficult to talk about groups. First of all, the group concept itself is rather difficult as a social group. Like, what is your sense of belonging? Of course, you have various identities. You are not limited to just being seen as the person with whatever X or Z, but you have a complex set of values, of interests, of aspects. So it's really tough to define groups. And also the second part, a lot of the aspects that cause discrimination or exclusion can overlap or even reinforce each other, as the concept of intersectionality. And I put a link down below where it's talked about much more in depth. I'm not going to address it here. I'm also not the expert on it. But so the idea is then not talking about groups, but thinking about, factors that contribute to people not being reached, not being engaged, being left out in science communication. In the project, we did an extensive literature review on practical reports and practical insights, as well as scientific literature, and compiled all these factors that have been reported there that can lead to exclusion, and put them together into typology. This typology we decided to divide into three categories: individual factors, social factors, and structural conditions, just for the sake of making it more clear and somehow making it accessible and actually being used by science communicators. Of course, we know that it's very difficult to very strictly distinguish between some of these aspects. Also, we included some overarching concepts such as socioeconomic status that can be divided even further, but that as constructs themselves are established in the discussion already. So there's some overlap also between social and individual factors. It's somewhat not clear where to clearly put one of the aspects we have identified. And lastly, also the structural conditions would apply at the side of science communicators, of science institutions, and in most cases they correspond to individual factors. So, for example, time resources that a person has correspond to the time and scheduling and planning on the side of the organization. So there are two aspects to think about the issue, but it's very clear for us that by naming individual factors, it of course is not the responsibility of the individual, of the excluded person or the marginalized person, to change something about their habits, or it's even their fault for being excluded, but rather in naming the issue and giving science communicators and science institutions some specific hints where to address their offers, where to change their science communication approaches to be more inclusive. We identified a total 31 of these factors, and even there it can be argued if there's something missing, if we should probably split something even further down. You're more than invited to leave your comments or suggestions on that below. And of course, in this video, we cannot go through all of them. This would take way too long. So I'm going to address only a very few as exemplary factors. But please feel free to add any thoughts you have in the comment section below. So this is the picture. We're going first talk about something that's maybe obvious, and financial resources or income. Well, we provided some data there, and also on this graphic we put some infographic elements with data. It's not all about only relevance or utilitarian thinking that only the most relevant or with the highest numbers factors to be addressed, but to give science communicators a sense of urgency, because a lot of people in our experience don't really have a feeling or understanding how many actually in the population in this case are, for example, not as well as financially well off as they are. So science communicators, often being academic, and even when coming from marginalized backgrounds, by being an academic, you're way better off than most parts of population. Of course, also in academia, there are issues that have just been addressed by precarious employments, short-term contracts, and only part-time positions, especially for younger researchers. So this is, of course, very true. But even if you compare that to the rest of the population, um, not speaking of individuals, but of households, see, for example, the number 9.5% of households in Germany have a monthly net income of less than 1,300 euros. So this is way below of a lot of academic salaries. Also, there's only 1.12 euros that is calculated in the monthly Hartz IV, so the social welfare rate in Germany for education. So, well, what can you get for that? So there's actually a lot going on, but you need to be aware of when you are a science communicator and when you create science communication offers. So of course, the most important aspect would be direct costs. So do you have entrance fees for your event? Well, you can think about if you have discount rates for maybe students or people in need or elderly people. But then there are also the indirect costs, such as travel costs or on-site catering that might be expensive and might actually hinder families of attend if you have, well, 5 people and everybody wants a drink and a snack, and it's a very high rate for that. There's a lot of cost associated with, for example, attending a science festival there. Travel costs, for example, to events. So there are a lot of things that are going on. There are some studies that show that it's not all about the money, and but it still is a very important aspect when you think about your science communication offers, and we probably can think about ways of mitigating these issues. For example, the example of catering. Well, also if you have the people, they have to make their money for their event, but you could make sure that it's allowed to bring own food and drinks, that there are seats where you can sit down without having to buy something, but still be able to attend the event and probably drink your own drinks. So just as a small example. One of the second aspects is also individual level, but also something that probably a lot of people are not aware of, that there's quite a significant number of people, and here's the example for Germany, but I would assume it's similar for other countries as well, that do have poor literacy or poor writing skills. So this does not mean that they cannot read or write at all. But this would mean that complex texts and then longer texts, being it online or in brochures or in other publications, are hard to process. And you could think about other ways of actually making your content accessible using graphics, uh, using easy language, for example, or simple language. So there are various things addressing this factor. Going to the social dimension, the regional affiliation of your audiences, or where your, well, institution or your event is situated, in a rural area or in, but could also be in marginalized urban districts. So of course, university lectures are held in the universities, but this is leaving large parts of the country out. And you could think, is there probably an approach? Okay, you need to have lectures also in other areas beyond your home institution. Do you want to go somewhere where there usually is not every other day as academic talk or whatever event? So really thinking about spreading your offers might be an approach, and going maybe it's difficult, maybe there haven't been events and it's difficult to attract an audience because it's just not part of the cultural life in that region or setting, but you could think about that. And the last factor I'm going to address as an example here is place or location as one example of the structural conditions. On the one hand, this includes the also maybe obvious aspects of accessibility, reachability, for example, by public transportation and barrier-free access, um, but also the atmosphere of the venues. And this is something you might overlook, and we have included that with a not so subtle hint in our graphic. Uh, the architecture of a museum, of a research center or university can have deterring effects on audiences. Like if you're not used to walking through huge classicistic columns and okay, how do you behave there? Can I as a normal person actually just walk in there? Is there a certain well, do we need to dress up or behave something like that? So it's communicating a lot of barrier actually, and it's a very subtle thing, but this does have effects on audiences. So, for example, think about hosting events or lectures in more friendly and inviting locations. Go somewhere where people usually also spend their free time. So a lot of activities that are doing that already. For example, science cafes or science pub is just one example, but there could also be other examples. So these are just, as mentioned, very few examples of all these other factors. So please do have a look at the others, and there's also on the linked version of the graphic on the backside, there's more detailed text on all of them, so you can have a more in-depth look. In concluding this introduction, I want to address one last aspect, and you see me here, and perhaps you see someone resembling that somewhat in the graphic. Who am I talking to you about this aspect, and who is this person? Obviously, also depicted as male, as the professor talking to the audience. I consider myself in most aspects also as a privileged person, and I really try to be aware of that. In talking about this and in conducting our research project, it was not our intention to take away voices of marginalized audiences or groups, but go on a more meta level above and compile the various aspects of exclusion and marginalization happening in, or that can happen in science communication. So the communities are very much engaged in their respective networks, and we're trying to bring that together and provide access for science communicators to reach out to these communities, to these engaged person, to these initiatives in these various fields, and reflect on their science communication activities in a variety of issues. So really trying to bridge the gap and bringing them together. And when you're actually thinking about doing science communication as a scientist or as a science communicator, organizing something, planning something, conducting science communication, definitely reach out to these audiences you identified as not being present, not being reached, not being engaged with your communication. Don't rely on the theoretical aspects here. What we had compiled here really should be seen as a first step, as an overview, and we try also in the remaining part of this lesson here, various sources, various additional voices to really paint a very broad picture, and that's really trying to provide hints and further leads to the various aspects of the field. But if you have anything that also should be part of this lesson that's not the case already, please leave any comments, any additional sources, any criticism, any further suggestions in the comment below. We really want to make this as open and as a growing lesson. So this really also benefit from your perspectives and from your voices and from your resources you could link to, or you could hint other people's, point them towards them. So with that being said, I would like to invite you explore the graphics, leave your thoughts, and explore the remaining videos and parts of this module here in the Lernraum. And I'm very much looking forward to your feedback and to your experiences.